Hey everyone, Andrew back again and welcome to another video, and as you can tell from the title, I'm here to briefly talk about my top 10 new wave of traditional heavy metal bands. So any band that was formed from the year 2000 that fits within the heavy metal genre or category. Now this is actually a video response or a thread response to Chris, Farley's Retro Fan Cave, and if for some reason you aren't subscribed to him already, I'm sure everyone from the VC that watches my videos knows who he is, but if not, I'll be leaving his channel link in the description box below. And make sure you check out his top 10 new wave of traditional heavy metal band video, because that was absolutely fantastic. Chris, you chose some really kick-ass bands. And yeah, I definitely wanted to do a response to this. I consider this decade or era of heavy metal to be kind of underrated in a lot of ways. I think a lot of people dismiss modern metal, and I don't know why. There's some absolutely amazing bands out there, and sure, you might have to do a little bit of digging and research to find them, but yeah, there's some absolutely killer bands, especially thrash wise. There's some absolutely phenomenal modern thrash bands. So with that being said, enough rambling on, let's actually get on to this top 10 list. So this is really in no particular order, but here is my top 10 new wave of traditional heavy metal bands. Alrighty, so to kick things off, we have Harlot, and these guys are an Australian thrash band. They were formed in 2006 and they have 3 studio albums. I'm not really too sure how well known they are overseas, but here in Australia amongst thrash fans they are pretty popular, and for good reason. They're basically a modern take on old school thrash, and they've got a very fast-paced feel to their music. Next up we have Municipal Waste, and I'm sure a lot of you guys, especially crossover thrash fans, are well familiar with these guys. They are pretty well known, pretty popular. They formed in 2001. They have 6 studio albums, their most recent being Slime and Punishment, which I thought was a fantastic release. These guys, I know exactly what I'm getting, and I'm a pretty big fan of most of their releases actually. It's just good old crossover thrash fun. Next up we have Elm Street. Now this is a Australian traditional heavy metal band and extremely underrated. They were formed in 2008 and they have 2 studio albums, both of which are really good. Now if you guys are familiar with the movie Deathgasm, the heavy metal / horror splatter comedy from New Zealand, you may recognise these guys because they had a couple of their songs used within that soundtrack. Big horror influences, especially on their debut album, but as I said, both albums are fantastic, so if you are a fan of traditional heavy metal and you want a really good modern band to get into, definitely give Elm Street a go. They are great. Next up we have Desecration, and I've already done a separate video on these guys, so if you're wanting my more in-depth thoughts on them and a more in-depth history and knowledge on the band, check that video out. These guys formed in 2008 and they've done a lot of touring internationally. They've worked pretty hard and they've toured with some pretty big name bands like Tankard, Warbringer, Sepultura, Havok, just to name a few. So they've been supporting acts for some pretty popular and big thrash bands. So yeah, they formed in 2008 and they've only just released their debut album earlier this year, To the Gallows. Absolutely fantastic album. Best way to describe these guys are they are an old school Bay Area thrash sound from the 80s. So if you're an 80s Bay Area thrash fan, you need to check Desecrator out. And also sort of what stands them apart from other modern thrash bands is definitely their sound and production. They're not overly polished. They've got a rather raw sounding production which works really well. Next up we have Warbringer. These guys formed in 2004 and they have 5 studio albums. I love these guys. They've got a very heavy sound, which I am a big fan of, but I really don't need to talk too much about them. I'm sure most of you thrash fans are pretty familiar with this band. Next up we have White Wizard, and these guys, I've talked about these guys before. They formed in 2007. They have 3 studio albums, all of which are really good. Quickest way and easiest way to describe these guys is they are a modern take on 80s Iron Maiden. So if you're an Iron Maiden fan from the 80s and you've never checked out White Wizard, definitely do so. Extremely underrated, and yeah, I'm a big fan of these guys. Next up we have Havok, which I'm sure is a band that a lot of thrash fans are pretty familiar with. They formed in 2004 and it took them a while to release their first album. Actually, I think their first album came out in 2009. They have 4 studio albums, the most recent being Conformicide, which is an absolutely phenomenal album. Best way to describe these guys is they've got a pretty modern sound while playing traditional thrash, if that kind of makes sense. So they have a traditional thrash sound just with a modern take on it. Next up we have Power Trip, and these guys are absolutely fantastic. They formed in 2008 and they've got 2 studio albums, the most recent one being Nightmare Logic, which I've actually seen in a lot of update videos, which is awesome because that is a killer album. These guys are fantastic. I'm a massive fan of Slayer, and I get a lot of Slayer influence within the sound with Power Trip, which is just awesome to me. So yeah, definitely one of my favourite modern thrash bands for sure. Next up we have Skullfest, and these guys formed in 2006. They have 2 studio albums, both of which are really, really good. And these guys have a very, very interesting mix of sound. They have a traditional heavy metal sound mixed with speed. Some people tend to think they have a thrash sound. I definitely consider it more speed. But the vocals are what really sort of sets this band apart from a lot of other modern bands. They kind of have a glam metal sound to them, and yeah, very, very interesting mix of sort of glam sounding vocals mixed with traditional metal and speed, and it all works really, really well. Yeah, big fan of these guys, pretty unique in that aspect, and both of the albums are really, really solid. And last but certainly not least, we have Gamma Bomb, and these guys formed in 2002. They have 5 studio albums and they are from Ireland. Probably my favourite crossover thrash band going around right now. These guys are just absolutely fantastic. They've got a great 80s retro sound to them, a lot of horror influences and just 80s pop culture, which I'm a massive fan of, and it works really, really well. They've also got a great blend of fun punk style lyrics mixed with thrash that is the perfect combination in my opinion, and they also have some absolutely fantastic cover arts with their albums. Alrighty, so there you go. That was just a quick rundown of my top 10 new wave of traditional heavy metal bands. And once again, if you are not subscribed to Chris or Farley's Retro Fan Cave, I'll be leaving his link in the description box below. I'd like to see some video responses to this. I'm sure Chris would as well. So get involved with this. Definitely let us know your top 10 new wave of traditional heavy metal bands. And also let me know what you think of the 10 that I have mentioned within this video. What have been some of your favourite bands that I have mentioned. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the video and thank you for watching.